Breaking news. Earlier this morning, Donald Trump in the United States launched a large-scale strike on Venezuela. President Maduro is now on being transported to the United States literally as we speak, and Trump just announced at Mar-a-Lago that we are going to run this country until a safe transition of power. The media is going to tell you this is all about drugs, cartels, restoring democracy. That's not even half the story. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves on the planet, over 303 billion barrels. They have moved massive gold deposits worth billions. They have silver, a ton of precious earth metals, you name it. And we're talking about literally over $3 trillion worth of natural resources. And Trump just made his move to take control of all of it. Let me show you exactly what's happening and why the media is going to hide a lot of this story. First, let's go into this breaking news here that we have from Donald Trump and the overall attack that we've gotten on Venezuela. So at 2 a.m. local time, there was massive explosions heard across Caracas. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, so my apologies, but there's a U.S. aircraft flying overhead, and strikes hit multiple locations at Venezuela's largest military base, their airport, and their targets. Now, Trump announced at the Mar-a-Lago press conference, which I'll show a clip here in a minute, that President Nicolas Maduro and his wife had been captured and flown out of the country. He said, quote, that we are going to run it and that they are going to run it until something is restored and power is restored here. And he said he's going to watch it real time from Florida. 0 U.S. casualties were here as well. And now there's something interesting that he also said here about oil, and don't take it from me. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
In Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust for a long period of time. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping and what could have taken place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
And so we all know that oil rules the world, right? It's all about energy. So their official justification of all of this is going to be, hey, this is about the war on drugs. This is about something bigger than just the oil industry. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, even though there was a $50 million bounty on President Maduro, which was raised from $15 million in August of 2025, and then there was the narcotics terrorism charges that had in 2020, the federal data does show that Venezuela has not been a significant source of the narcotics entering the U.S. Look, I mean, obviously there has been a lot of areas and, you know, publicity around Venezuela. And I'm not here to say that Venezuela or any other country, you know, it was all strictly like this big giant narcotic thing. I'm here to say that it's not just about the war on drugs. Major Taylor Greene even came out and said this is a clear move for control over Venezuela's oil supplies. Now, if we sit back and look, even Vice President J.D. Vance came out and said that, hey, on X, this stolen oil must be returned to the United States. And, you know, Trump has already said that he's going to run the country after they've striked on Venezuela. So if we look at the numbers, right, there's 303 billion barrels of oil. And we can look at this. I like to show this visual capitalist because I think this is good when you kind of compare it, because it's literally 18% of the entire world's oil reserves. It's more than Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Canada, Iraq. I mean, all of these things, right, is absolutely huge. So it's 5 times more than the U.S., who have just 55 billion barrels. So the massive deposit of crude oil is in eastern Venezuela, and it stretches literally 55,000 kilometers. And they estimate that they could pump out 900 to 1.4 billion barrels of crude oil every single day. So this is partially proven and unproven, but right now they have 380 to 652 billions that could be technically recoverable. and they're just sitting on this oil. They haven't been really properly doing all of this, right? So I think that it is insane that they haven't been pumping all of this oil, and it's for deeper reasons, right? There's been essentially the power of control, being able to continue to push this narrative forward that, hey, you know what, Venezuela isn't so bad. They've had heavy on sour crude. Most of the Gulf Coast refineries were specifically built to process this type of oil, but they haven't been doing it. So even though the US produces oil, it produces a different kind. And we don't have to necessarily get into the huge differences between the light, sweet crude, which is better for the gasoline, and the Venezuelan heavy crude, which is more essential for like the diesel, asphalt, and industrial fuels. But, the diesel fuels do have a tight supply, and Venezuela's essentially been having a stranglehold on this. They haven't really done all this. And if you look at this major crash since 2020 of the Venezuelan oil industry, I mean, it's absolutely massive. It just falls off a cliff, this production, because, the way that this has all come through, right? Trump's plan is that if US companies are allowed to go back and rebuild the Venezuelan oil industry, it could be a game changer for the global oil market, right? It'll get U.S. oil majors like Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips back into Venezuela when they've essentially been run out of town by these narco terrorists. And it would restore 3 million plus barrels per day. And this would also potentially undercut the OPEC pricing power, which I think would be very interesting. So this all is to say, what the hell is going on and why is there a deeper plan to all this? It's all about the natural resources, right? Because if you look at the oil reserves for countries, Venezuela is right under Saudi Arabia, right? It's head and shoulders above this. So I think that this is absolutely major, and this is the bigger story behind all of this. It is not, hey, this is a war on drugs. This is all about, the oil reserves in Venezuela and how, it's been essentially falling off a cliff throughout all of this. I mean, if you look at the oil reserves by countries, look, there's basically none in South America except for Venezuela. It's just huge. And of course, there's Saudi Arabia, but everywhere else, for some reason, there's just massive amounts in Venezuela, and it just hasn't been tapped in there. So I think as we continue to uncover what the real reasons behind all this is, I think you could look at the natural resources as well and see, hey, it has the most oil, but it also has something very interesting, and they've been dropping their reserves recently as well, and it's been in gold, right? So gold and the precious metals, the physical commodities, have been doing super well here lately. It has central bank holdings valuing at 161 tons of gold. And the central bank, as of 2024, its current value is about $7 to $10 billion. It has the largest gold reserves in Latin America, more than Brazil, who has 130 tons, or Mexico at 120. But here's what they're not telling you. They have exploitable mining deposits, because Venezuela has a massive networks of mining, right? It's located primarily in the Bolivar state. They have a literally 88 kilometers of gold mining district. And its famous date, it has famous deposits as well. It has gold at the current gold prices. They're literally potentially up to $850 billion. But they've been depleting their gold lately too. Their gold reserves have been systematically sold off. 10 years ago, their reserves were worth about $40 billion. They've burned through $35 billion of their gold reserves in a decade. They've been selling gold to Russia, China, and Turkey to pay for their food and medicine imports. So it is really interesting that we see Venezuela starting to move away from the dollar and move away and seeing their currency essentially get hyperinflated away so they can, go through and buy these medicines and food from other countries and selling and doing these trades via gold. So, of course, the United States doesn't like to see other countries doing trade outside of the US dollar. And then on top of it, they don't like to see other countries essentially hyperinflate and help out their enemies, help out things like China. How about the guys like China and Russia? I mean, look, who was in who was in Venezuela literally right before this bombing took place? Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. So I think when we keep diving in and uncovering all this, it is deeper than just the narco terrorisms, right? Because even though they've had 1.2 billion in gold frozen at the Bank of England because it won't give it back to Maduro, the UK won't give it back to Maduro, selling gold to China, Turkey, and Russia, that is not a good representation for the United States being friends with you, too, right? And then they've also had an illegal mining crisis where they've armed groups, cartels, and even terrorist organizations to control their gold mines. There's been massive amounts of human rights abuses, like slave labor conditions, a lot of like technical issues like underneath the surface with all that. And then there's over 1,000 square miles of the Amazon rainforest, that have been destroyed by their illegal mining operations. So it goes much, much deeper than just this drug bust, because this now gives Trump a humanitarian cover story for their intervention, right? And on top of it, right, it's not just gold. They have a bunch of natural resources as well. They have natural gas, about 5.6 trillion cubic meters of reserves, the second largest in the Western Hemisphere after the United States. They have a shit ton of iron at 4.1 billion tons of proven reserves. And it's, it could produce up to 19.2 million tons per year at its peak. It has a bunch of aluminum, 5.2 million tons. And aluminum accounts for 20% of their metal exports. It's got a bunch of coal for energy. It's the third largest producer in Latin America after Colombia and Brazil. And they have a ton of rare earth metals as well, rare earth minerals as well, like coltan, copper, and silver. And of course, we've seen what's going on with the silver markets lately as well, right? So there are a ton of reasons why the United States would have a lot of incentive to go into Venezuela. And it's not just to protect the United States over these drug cartels. Of course, it is a good humanitarian reason. But farther than that, right? I mean, outside of Maduro being wanted, outside of Maduro, kind of being this drug lord and bringing in drugs to the United States, I mean, at the end of the day, there's been, more, let's say, drugs brought in from other countries as well. I mean, Trump's called out Colombia. He's called out all of these other countries, and he says that they're up next. But the pattern isn't new to any of this, right? I mean, when you see things like this, the amount of gold reserves just dropping and falling off a cliff, I'll make this a little bit bigger for you guys. When you see, these kinds of charts like this, right? It isn't new. The U.S. has had a very clear pattern of invading countries with resources, right? And it's always been under the guise of humanitarian intervention or fighting terrorism. I mean, we had Iran in 1953, where we were going after the oil there, fighting communism. But in reality, the CIA overthrew democratically elected prime minister at the time, and after he nationalized the oil industry, right? So then we intervened in Guatemala in 1954 because we were trying to get up their agricultural land, and our excuse there was fighting communism. In Iraq, of course, in 2023, what we recently got out of, our excuse was the masses of weapons of mass destruction, but there was literally no weapons of mass destruction found there. But the U.S. oil companies got contracts, and Iraq was the fifth largest oil reserves at the time. Then, of course, we went into Libya in 2011, and we said, hey, we're protecting civilians. We destabilized that country, and then the oil infrastructure opened to the Western companies. Then we've gone into Congo, Syria, all of these places. And it's all been around oil or precious metals, right? It's never been about the drugs, even though this is what this ruse will be about, right? Because every single one of these interventions followed the same playbook. demonize the leader. But look, okay, we do see the Venezuelans. It is very positive. You know, we do WMDs. Yeah, who knows where those are, McLovin? We never found any of them. I see a lot of you guys in the chat. Welcome. But yes, there isn't a war, unfortunately, based on ethics, it seems, right? It's all been about resources, always, right? And look, I'm not saying that Maduro was this stand-up citizen by any means, but the framing around this is never always as black and white as people want to make it, right? Because every single one of these interventions has followed the same playbook. We're going to demonize the leader. So yeah, Maduro, he has had terrorism, bounties on him for since 2020, right? So I'm not saying that this is, he's a stand-up guy or anything by any means. Then the second is we want to make it a humanitarian crisis native, right? We want to help the Venezuelan refugees, the poverty, the oppression. They were a national security threat with a lot of drugs and terrorism. Yeah, that's how we're kind of framing it. Then we want to say we want to put economic sanctions that create suffering. So we've put on these U.S. sanctions onto Venezuela since 2017. And then now we have the military intervention, and we're going to present it as liberation. And that literally happened overnight. Luckily, no U.S. soldiers or anything passed or anything like that. And look, we've going to potentially install some friendly government that opens up the resources to the U.S. companies. Now, we can only hope that when we get this going forward, because obviously, we've seen a major shift in Latin America just in general, right? We've seen, Milei in Argentina try to come in and basically chop everything down. We've seen Bukele in El Salvador, and we'll see whoever we put into place here in Venezuela. And, that's essentially the narrative going around, right? Trump's going to come in and put in his guys. Are they going to be good for the country? I guess time will tell, right? I mean, are we going to be looking into the best nature of Venezuela? Or, as All Nighter Hider is saying, or are we going to make them use the dollar? Because they were doing foreign trade in gold. Gold and oil are always these common themes when we take a deeper look into what is going on, right? And, the United States has its own struggles as well, right? If we go in and look at the interest rates, are we going to cut interest rates because we've got massive amounts of inflation? How is the dollar doing based on this, right? Like based on that news when it happened literally overnight, the dollar's, been relatively stagnant today, about 0.16, as we keep going through. And, Trump has literally said all of this quiet stuff out loud, right? I mean, about what's going on. He's come out and said, we're going to be very strongly involved in Venezuela's oil industry. President J.D. Vance said stolen oil must be returned to the U.S. This is a resource extraction, folks. It's dressed up as counter narcotics. So let's ask the question, why are we going to do this now? Well, we had China in Venezuela literally right before, right? So the Chinese diplomats arrived in Venezuela to talk at the Maduro house hours before, if this ad would go away. But, when you look at this, right, China has made massive inroads in South America. They've made trade deals, infrastructure investments. They've done it with rare earth metals. And China wants to control the global supply chain. And Trump's national security strategy in 2025 basically is like go against China. He wants to make sure China doesn't have any access to beat them there, right? He's come out and said that. He's potentially very worried about the Venezuelan-Chinese relationship because Venezuela owes China billions in outstanding loans. And China has been buying up Venezuelan oil at discounted prices. So obviously some oil and gold, issues here. And Trump wants to watch the U.S. reassert itself in its own backyard, right? The U.S. sphere of influence, or the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, he wants to make sure that we still have that influence in Latin America. And he wants to send the message to China that you're not going to control resources in our hemisphere, right? And it's not just China. It's also Russia, too. Because Russia has $10 billion in outstanding loans to Venezuela. Russian companies have oil deals in Venezuela. There's been military cooperation. Putin has come out and Russia's called it a slap in the face that the U.S. didn't inform them. And Putin may use this to negotiate with Ukraine. Putin might use this, and he might say, help me in Venezuela, and I'll help you in Ukraine, basically. And then there's also been more, alliances here, right? There's been the Venezuela and Iran alliance, right? Both have been under heavy sanctions of the U.S. And both have been Iran has been helping Venezuela repair its refineries. And Iran is in that BRICS, right? The BRICS are going against the dollar. So the U.S. is essentially killing two birds with one stone with all this, right? Strike at Venezuela. There's a strike at an Iranian ally, and it cuts off the Iranian influence in the Western Hemisphere. So with this, midterm elections coming up, Trump needs some wins. He needs some lower gas prices. So what will this Venezuelan oil do? It'll help pump those prices. And what happens next, right? The U.S. will help transition the government in Venezuela. We'll get some boots on the ground. And we're going to see how this all is going to play out. I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on this. So make sure you guys are hitting that like button. Hit the new hype feature too if you see it. And hit the subscribe button. Let me know in the comments what you think of all this. Thank you guys all for joining me this Saturday. And stay tuned because I've got a lot of videos coming up next.